tend to walk around, so I'm gonna see how this goes. Before I jump in, big thank you to Chris, Mina, the sponsors, the Granada, for putting this on. What a cool day, right? A lot of good speakers, really cool technologies, and it's awesome to see kind of how things advance. I don't know about you, but after seeing David's 3JS demo, all I can think about is pumpkin pie right now. So lunch can't come soon enough. As Chris mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Capistrano today, which is a way of deploying websites or applications that is automated and reproducible. So just by show of hands, has anybody used Capistrano before? A few folks? Okay, awesome. A lot of this then will be pretty familiar to you. For the rest that haven't, hopefully this will kind of show you a new way of doing things that will hopefully make your lives easier, which as developers is awesome. That's what we like to do, make things easier, faster, and just in general more awesome. A little bit about me before we jump into it. I work at a company called SQ1. We are a digital marketing agency, and we focus on building websites and experiences with a focus on conversion optimization. So that's us. Check us out, sq1.com. So there's a lot of different ways to deploy websites. These are just a few of the different ones. Of course, server-side editing, as Chris was mentioning, FTP upload. Some programs have a file sync. You can either do file syncing through the command line, or you can do it through programs that will basically set up. A lot of IDEs, I think, will do this, where you can set up and map a remote folder and then just kind of synchronize your files as they're updated. Getting into a little bit more advanced configurations, you can set up remote repositories as your website, so that you just push from your repo up to the remote, and by doing that push, it will update your website. You can also tie into different hooks within the repositories and version control to do different actions once you make a push. There's different third-party deployment services. There's actually one, I think, called ftploy that's pretty cool, Deploy HQ, other ones like that. And then, of course, more advanced kind of continuous integration, where it's continually building and updating stuff. So, all sorts of different ways of doing things. If you take one thing from this, I would say try and avoid the top two. Capistrano, as well as all these, some of these other ones are easy ways to make that process of getting your code and getting your updates live a lot easier. So what are some of the challenges with those deployment processes and those methods? Oftentimes it's very manual. You have to kind of remember the steps of what changed, what you need to push, what you need to update, or you'll kind of like just take the entire project and then upload it and send it over. Because of that manual process, there's a very high risk of error. It's very easy to break something, which, especially if you're pushing code to a production environment, we want to avoid. We don't want to break the live site, and then that causes some problems. Typically, as well, there's not really a record or a log of those deployments. Maybe who did the deployment, who pushed that update. Not necessarily, or it's necessarily not well documented or easily distributable. So if you're working with a team, managing those deployments and that process can be cumbersome, especially if it's all up here, which there's the whole bus factor as well in that scenario. Difficult to manage for multiple environments too. So if you have a development or a staging environment as well as a production environment, managing and knowing, okay, I need to deploy to this environment, but I maybe have a little something different that I need to do for development, load in dev data instead of loading in production data, so forth. As well as updates are usually difficult to undo or to reverse. So in that scenario where you push something up to production and the live site breaks, you kind of go into that fire drill and that panic mode of, how do I get that back? How do I undo what I just did? So in fact, all of these challenges, Capistrano solves for us, which is pretty awesome, and big surprise, kind of the point of my session today. So what is Capistrano? Capistrano is a remote server automation and deployment tool that provides versioned releases and easy rollbacks. So I've highlighted a few keywords there that kind of should jump out to you as features or good things about this tool. It automates stuff, so it's not a manual process. It's very automated. Of course, it's deployment, so it's actually pushing or shipping that code to your environments. It keeps track of your deployments, so it has that versioned releases of what you deploy, and it allows you to easily roll back if you need to. So, a little overview of Capistrano there. How does it actually work? Capistrano is, and I'm kind of jumping a little bit around in this order, but it's executed from your local computer through command line. So it's a command line utility. It's actually a Ruby gem that you install. And it creates scripts that you configure and basically say, when I run a deployment, I want it to do these specific things. The great thing about that is that those scripts are stored in your project. So if you're using Git, Subversion, Mercurial, if you're using a version control, your deployments are versioned as well. So take a scenario where you're rolling out a new feature into your website that changes your deployment process. When you make that change and when you deploy that new process, or when you roll out that new process, you update your scripts, and now that's versioned within your repository and within your project. So if you ever need to roll back to an earlier version of the project, you're going to roll back to the previous deployment process as well. So it kind of stays within the state of your project. When you execute the deployment command, it connects directly to your server over SSH. So there's a few dependencies there. You need to make sure that you have SSH access to your server. It connects to your repository, hosted repository on GitHub or Bitbucket or any type of hosted repository, and checks out the code from there. So if you're working in a team environment, that's very helpful because the code that you're going to deploy is the code that's on the repository from a specific branch that you decide. Once it checks out that code, it runs through these automated tasks, makes updates, and then logs and versions that release, and then, of course, gives you the ability to easily roll back. So I know these are a lot of words, so I did a little diagram to kind of illustrate how Capistrano works. So there's really three components to Capistrano. There's your local environment, which is your actual computer you would be developing on. Of course, your server that you're going to be deploying to, and then your repository, so where the code lives that you're going to be deploying, where that code is that you're going to deploy. So let's see it in action. You run that command from your local environment, which then connects to your server over SSH. Your server reaches out to the repository and updates your project code from that, and then it issues a new release, logs a deployment, and you're good to go. There's some magic that Capistrano does on the server to manage those releases, and it uses symlinks or aliases to kind of keep track of the release that's current. The great thing about that is that, let's say you have a specific migration process that you need to do when you're deploying code. So you push a deployment, and then you want to do a database backup, or you want to synchronize maybe an uploads directory with another directory on your server. It will do all of those things before it actually makes that deployment live. So it kind of has a build process, and then it flips the switch and makes it live by using those symlinks. And I'll show an example of that directory structure so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But the benefit of that is that it does those deployments with no downtime. It does that build, and then it just changes the symlink, which makes it live, which happens in microseconds. So a few steps on installation and setup of Capistrano. Like I mentioned, it's a Ruby gem, so you just install it from command line by running gem install Capistrano. Once you've installed it and once it's on your local computer, you want to change directories into your project. If you remember back, I mentioned that those deployment scripts are stored in your project files or in your project itself. So you want to change directories into your project and then just run the command cap install. That's going to set up a few files and just kind of get the groundwork in place. And then you can open those files and just change the values of those variables to your specific project and pretty much go from there. Pretty easy to get started and get set up. So how do you actually use it? Once you've got your Capistrano installed, you have your project initialized, you've got your variables changed to your specific project settings themselves or your server settings. How do you actually run a deployment? Really easy. I mentioned that there's multiple environments. Capistrano has built-in support for handling deployments to those. So to run a deployment to your production environment, you just run the command cap production deploy. If you're running it to your development environment or staging environment, you would just change out production with your environment itself. So cap development deploy, cap production deploy, cap staging deploy, so forth. And then, of course, rolling back is really easy. You just pass in that rollback task to the deploy action. So cap production, deploy, rollback. Rollback happens very, very quickly. So if you are in that scenario where you've deployed something and it breaks your live site or you find an issue that you didn't catch in QA, you can issue that command and roll it back really easily. So I was mentioning when you run that cap install, it creates a few files and kind of gets things set up. Within your project directory, these are the files that it will create. You'll see there's a cap file that basically just sets up the dependencies, makes sure that Capistrano is pulling in the things that it needs. And then you'll have a config folder. Within that config folder, you're going to have a deploy.rb. Capistrano is written in Ruby, but don't be scared or afraid. I'm not a Ruby developer, but it's super easy to get in and just kind of change those variables and those values to match your project. But you've got your deploy.rb, which is kind of your global variables. So the variables that apply to all of your environments. And then you've got your deploy directory with your different environment-specific configurations. So production, staging. Take the example of you have different servers for production for your live site and a different server for your staging environment or your development environment. Within those specific environment configuration files, you can specify what server to go to when you deploy to that environment. So pretty awesome and pretty easy. Sometimes, depending on your project directory structure, if you have a config file, Capistrano won't conflict with that. It will just add these files into that folder. So you don't have to worry about, naming convention with those folders. It's really those files that Capistrano will look for, naming convention conflicts. On the server, so when you run your first deployment, and there's a few tasks if you want to do some initial configuration on the server and set it up first. But when you run your first deployment, so cap production deploy, Capistrano is going to SSH into your server and make sure that there's the certain files and directory structure and everything set up on your server. And that's what this looks like. So you'll see there's a few different folders here. Down at the bottom, you've got that file that is your revisions. So that's your log of all of the deployments you run. When you ran that deployment, who ran the deployment, so it'll actually pass through the user that did that deployment. You have a shared folder, and that directory you can drop in, or that shared directory is shared across all of your deployments or all of your releases. So the benefit there is, let's take, for example, you have, like a WordPress site that has your WP uploads folder. You'll drop your uploads folder into the shared directory, And then in your Capistrano files, you'll say, hey, this is a linked directory. So when you run a deployment, go ahead and link it to what's in shared, and it'll do all that for you. You just specify what folders are shared, and it does the rest. You've got the repo itself, so that's kind of the main code. When Capistrano SSHs into your server, and then it connects to your repository and pulls the code down, it pulls it into the repo there, so you kind of have a running up-to-date version. And then it will make a copy or a snapshot of your project into the release directory. You'll see the folders within releases are date and timestamp, so you'll know exactly when that deployment ran. Even if you're running deployments like immediately after each other, it will have unique directories there. And then I was mentioning the symlinks and the aliases and how Capistrano uses that to make those deployments happen. Does the build and then changes that directory or changes that symlink for a no downtime deployment. That's current. Current is where you'll want to point your web root or your document root in your virtual host files. So when you configure your server and you say, I want to point this URL or this virtual host to this directory, make sure you point it to current. And the reason for that is current is actually an alias to your most recent deployment. So what happens is when you run a new deployment, it's going to create a new release directory and snapshot. It's going to do all of those tasks and the builds, whatever you configure it to do. And then when it's ready, it's going to symlink current to that release, which makes that code live, that release live. When you do a rollback, what it does, because we have versions of these releases, Capistrano just changes the symlink to the next previous release. So rollbacks happen instantaneously. Pretty awesome. So the directory structure for your server, pretty straightforward and simple there as well. That's kind of it. So I have a link down at the bottom where I've got all the slides for this presentation. It, of course, takes you to the front porch lanyard place. My handle on the internet, GitHub, Twitter, all sorts of stuff is Galen Andrew, so check me out there. But that's Capistrano. Hopefully this gave you a little bit of an overview, kind of inspired you to dive into it a little bit and maybe rethink how you're pushing code to your different environments. And hopefully you'll find Capistrano to make that easier for you. So thank you.